Hello and welcome to Toast and Topics. Today, we're heading to one of the nation's busiest airports, Newark Liberty International, where a recent air traffic control meltdown has had everyone talking. In short, just a few weeks ago, Newark's air traffic radar system failed, not once, but multiple times, leaving controllers briefly blind in the control room for a tense stretch of time.
Yeah, and this discussion hits pretty close to home for me, quite literally, since Newark Airport is pretty much right in my backyard. So I think it's an important topic to be discussed. And in this episode, we'll break down what exactly went wrong in that radar shutdown incident. And then we'll zoom out and look at Newark's broader troubles, including chronic equipment glitches and staffing shortages that actually set the scene for these challenges. And finally, we'll use this as a case study to explore how air traffic control problems are affecting airports nationwide. In particular, why the air traffic control system is so vulnerable to some of these issues and how they could potentially be fixed or improved.
Yeah, in that vein, why don't we start off with the story of the radar failure that put Newark in the news?
The saga really began on April 28th this year. In the early morning hours of that day, the radar and radio communication systems for Newark's airspace went completely dark. For nearly 90 seconds, air traffic controllers lost all radar contact and radio communication with planes that were bound for Newark. And it's a pretty crazy situation to imagine. Think of the perspective of an air traffic controller. You're responsible for dozens of aircraft in one of the busiest airspaces in the nation, and suddenly your screens go blank. It's pretty scary and traumatic, in fact.
It's true. 90 seconds might not sound like a long time, but in aviation, for the reasons that you described, Sachin, it can feel like an eternity. And there's essentially no immediate solution when the radar and radios go down. You just have to wait for them to reboot and pray that nothing goes wrong in the meantime.
Yeah, fortunately, the outage was brief, but the fallout was definitely huge. Several controllers went on a 45-day trauma leave after the incident, meaning that they wouldn't be back at work for over a month. And this immediately thinned out an already stretched workforce. For travelers, the radar failure kicked off delays and many disruptions. Hundreds of flights ended up canceled the following week. So clearly, this impacted a lot more people than just the air traffic controllers.
Yeah, and the incident ultimately underlines how fragile and also important air traffic control infrastructure is. And unfortunately, that April 28th outage was not a one-off fluke. In the following 2 weeks, there were at least two more incidents where Newark's air traffic control systems faltered. And on one occasion in early May, there was another brief outage due to the same tech issues. Immediately after this, the Federal Aviation Administration held emergency meetings and imposed limits at Newark to contain the chaos. They capped the number of flights at Newark to 56 per hour, which is about a 15% reduction from Newark's normal air traffic volume. And that cap is set to last at least through mid-June while they work on fixes. And the result is that airlines have had to cut back on flights into and out of Newark. And even with fewer flights, delays are still very common at this airport.
While this was a truly horrible month for travelers at Newark, the reality is that Newark's controllers and their union have been warning about problems for quite some time. So there were some other underlying issues at a larger scale here that are worth discussing. One major factor behind this issue is aging equipment. And the truth is, a lot of the tech infrastructure in our air traffic control system is old and outdated, and Newark is no exception to that. In fact, a recent FAA assessment found that 76% of the agency's air traffic control systems are either unsustainable or at risk of becoming unsustainable. And that's quite a large percentage when you think about it. The other thing worth highlighting is the issue of staffing. Newark has been running on a thin crew of controllers and has been short-staffed for quite a long time before this recent issue. In fact, just a few weeks after the incident, one overnight shift had as few as three radar controllers that were monitoring the entire airspace of Newark Airport.
Now, a lot of Newark's recent troubles trace back to one decision, the FAA's move to relocate Newark's air traffic control operations last year. And this is a really important part of the story. Until late 2024, the controllers handling Newark's approaches and departures were based at the New York TRACON facility on Long Island. TRACON stands for Terminal Radar Approach Control Center. And basically, the radar room that guides planes near the airport is this facility. New York's TRACON handles JFK, LaGuardia, and New York, and it was notoriously understaffed. And the FAA was having a lot of trouble hiring enough people at the New York facility, just given that New York real estate prices are very expensive. And so, after years of talk, the FAA decided to split off Newark's control and to move it 85 miles away from TRACON to Philadelphia. And they figured that Philly, with its lower cost of living, could attract and also retain new controllers more easily.
That's interesting. And I guess on paper, that move could have helped relieve staffing crunches that they had seen at that Tracon facility in New York. And indeed, the FAA did say that the goal was to improve controller staffing levels by using the Philly facility. But this relocation actually came with some unintended consequences. The Philadelphia Tracon that now oversees Newark's airspace does not have the radar infrastructure on site for Newark. Instead, they've been essentially piping in the radar data from New York via a system of network lines, and it turns out that those telecom lines were not all properly hardened or backed up for this arrangement, which was a major contributing factor to this latest problem. So, in short, Newark's radar outage was somewhat of a self-inflicted problem stemming from a combination of old infrastructure as well as a somewhat poorly executed transfer of operations.
Interesting. So we've focused on Newark up to this point, but we keep hinting that these problems are not isolated, and it's true, they're not. In many ways, Newark is a microcosm of what's ailing the air traffic control systems nationwide. And so let's look at the bigger picture. The U.S. air traffic control system as a whole is strained by the same staffing shortages, aging technology, and rising air travel demand that we've talked about with respect to Newark. And Newark just happened to hit the breaking point here in a dramatic way, but other regions have been feeling the strain too. In terms of staffing across the country, the FAA simply doesn't have as many certified controllers as it should. The FAA is about 3,000 to 3,500 controllers short of its target staffing levels nationwide. And that's out of roughly 14,000 required positions. So it's a pretty significant gap. And the shortage means that the controllers who are employed are working overtime quite often, 6 days a week in many cases, just to cover existing air traffic. And that can lead to fatigue, which is a major safety concern in this profession in particular. Then there's the technology angle. We touched on it with Newark's old radar and communication systems. This is a problem on a national scale as well. A lot of air traffic control infrastructure is old school, with some towers dating back to the 1960s or the 1970s. So your grandparents, possibly when they were starting their careers, were using facilities that are still in use today. In fact, the average air traffic control tower is 40 years old as of 2024, and many radars and computer systems still in use were designed literal decades ago. We've been talking for years about next gen modernization for a nation's air traffic control, for example, by using satellite-based tracking, modern displays, etc. And while progress has been made, it's been slower than has been hoped, which is unsurprising considering the strain that we're dealing with now. And then finally, demand for air travel, it's just with zeroing in on this, has increased really dramatically over the years, and that's compounded all of these issues. In 2013, American Airlines carried about 643 million domestic passengers. By 2019, that number had grown to 811 million, a 26% increase. And by 2023, domestic passenger volume was back near to those 2019 pre-pandemic levels. In line with all of this, the number of scheduled flights increased by about 21% until right up before COVID, so 2013 to 2019. And forecasts just generally suggest that global air passenger demand is going to be increasing very substantially, both in the United States and elsewhere. And so the Newark incident is kind of a canary in the coal mine. The same underinvestment and staffing problems are present elsewhere, and Newark just happened to flare up first. It's prompting a lot of people to ask, how do we make sure the systems here hold up as travel continues to grow?
It's a good question you're asking, Ben, and I think it's worth us discussing the staffing problem in particular because it's really at the heart of this. There's a few reasons why we find it hard to hire air traffic controllers in particular compared to some other jobs. The first is rigorous training with high dropout rates. The training process for air traffic controllers is long and challenging. Even after candidates pass initial tests and screening, they undergo months of academy training and then years of on-the-job training at their assigned facility. So it could take around 2 to 3 years for a new controller to become fully certified and actually in their seat. Given this, many trainees do not actually make it to the finish line. The dropout rate is about 35% in the air traffic control profession. And that means that over a third of people who start their training either fail or just leave because it's not the right fit. The FAA has acknowledged this as a bottleneck. They bring in, say, 100 trainees, but only 65 of those might become certified controllers. So simply hiring more bodies doesn't instantly translate to more qualified controllers on duty. But that said, the FAA does need to maintain that high standard given the importance of this job in particular. The second issue is a big retirement wave that we've been seeing. Air traffic control has a mandatory retirement age of 56, which is a rule
Wow.
set for safety because performance can definitely decline as you get older. Many controllers currently on the job were hired in the 1980s or so, and those folks are now in their 50s and are hitting that retirement age. So there's been a wave of veteran air traffic controllers leaving the workforce each year. And given the stress of this field of work, a lot of air traffic controllers do take that retirement as soon as they can. But the problem is that the FAA now is literally losing experienced controllers faster than it can train new ones. And that
Mm.
issue has compounded along with the rise in air traffic volumes. Finally, I think there's longer term disruptions driven by COVID in part. During the peak of the pandemic, the FAA paused or slowed the pace of new training classes. For example, training in simulators or on site was limited by social distancing and the nature of the pandemic. For this reason, fewer new controllers came back into the workforce between 2020 and 2021. And by the time air traffic demand roared back in 2022 and 2023, the agency was behind on hiring. They've since been trying to catch up on this issue. For instance, the FAA hired 1,800 new controllers last year and has the goal to hire 2,000 more in 2025. But again, those folks won't be fully certified for a few years, so this issue won't be resolved overnight. So, in short, the air traffic control staffing issue is fairly structural and slow moving. You really can't just solve it with a quick hiring blitz like you might in other industries, and it requires a lot of planning, multiple years ahead, as well as new training programs and improving recruitment. So, the FAA and Congress have really been playing catch up on this for a while.
Looking nationally, there's a growing push for big reforms and investments in air traffic control to prevent the kinds of issues that you're discussing, Sachin, from compounding. And I think it's worthwhile to spend a second here on these efforts before we wrap up. And really, the immediate action items that can be performed by the United States are, well, number one, major funding for modernization. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy has been very vocal about needing to rebuild air traffic control infrastructure. And in early May, he cited the Newark debacle and other incidents as evidence that we really do need to pour money into modernizing the system. And he has talked about asking Congress for tens of billions of dollars for upgrades. And in fact, a House committee approved a $12.5 billion funding package for the air traffic control system through 2029 as an initial down payment on its modernization. And these funds will likely go into areas like replacing old radar systems, updating computer hardware and software, building new control towers where needed, and implementing just generally next gen technology faster. And the idea is to tackle here the decades of underinvestment that have left the system vulnerable. The second way to help ameliorate some of these problems is by just boosting training and hiring. I mean, Sachin, you very convincingly outlined some of the training issues that the ATC currently faces, and the FAA is right now trying to fix that by ramping up hiring with the goal of bringing on thousands of new controllers over the next few years. And they opened a new application window for controller candidates and are aiming for 1,500 to 2,000 hires per year in the near term to improve the success rate of trainees. That is the extent to which they actually stay on through these programs. They announce bonuses for them. For example, there's a $5,000 bonus for academy graduates when they complete their initial training phases. And they're also offering bonuses for hard to staff locations, for example, like New York, to attract more people to work there. And finally, they're also trying to stall some of the wave of retirement that we've been seeing recently among air traffic controllers. For example, the FAA rolled out an incentive to provide a 20% of base pay lump sum if a retirement eligible controller stays on an extra year. Hopefully, all of that helps. And for Newark specifically, one positive outcome here is that everyone is paying attention to this problem: passengers, pilots, policymakers, and more. And so, this is an issue that has some near term momentum. And we can really only hope that some of these short term patches turn into longer term reforms to avoid potential tragedy down the line.
That's right. We'll keep our fingers crossed that these reforms actually do take hold. And in the meantime, to our audience, if you're flying this summer, you may need to have some extra added patience given some of these ongoing issues. But as you said, Ben, hopefully these will correct and in the long run create a safer airspace for us all. So that's all we've got for you on today's episode of Toast and Topics. We'll see you again next time where we plan to revisit the fiscal deficit in the United States, its trajectory, and the extent to which it's sustainable. We'll see you then. Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and follow us on the podcasting platform of your choice, and try sharing it with a friend or family member to see what they think. We'll catch you next time.